Hello, my name is Elizabeth Dillenburg, and in this presentation, I'm going to be exploring the Girlhood of Maori girls, domestic servant debates in New Zealand. And I do have a presentation that I would like to share with you that includes some images. At the beginning of the 20th century, the chronic shortage of servants, or servant crisis, reached an acute stage in New Zealand. Domestic service in New Zealand had traditionally been done primarily by British girls or girls of European descent, but the attraction of better paying, less labor intensive, and more respectable employment opportunities for girls and women meant that the demand for servants perpetually exceeded the supply. And this is true in New Zealand, but in other parts of the British Empire as well. So you can see I have a couple of advertisements on this screen, and these were basically used to try and encourage girls and young women from Britain to migrate to New Zealand to work as domestic servants. But despite such propaganda campaigns and other efforts, there was still this dire shortage of servants in New Zealand. Now, realizing that orthodox solutions to the servant crisis were not working, Lady Anna Stout, who was actually a well-known figure not only in New Zealand, but also in Britain for her work in the suffrage and temperance movements, she advocated a different solution: train Maori girls as domestic servants. Given the difficulties of immigrating British girls to work as domestic servants, she contended that, quote, "It was quite wrong for New Zealanders to send across the sea for girls to help them in their homes when there were so many Maori girls." So Stout recommended the establishment of schools that would train Maori girls to become domestic servants. And in outlining her plan to the Maori Congress in Wellington in 1908, Stout emphasized the mutual benefits of her proposal for both the Maori and the Pākehā, which are European settlers or those of European descent. The plan would provide British settlers with the ready supply of servants. And again, this is something that they desperately wanted. But according to Stout, it would also uplift the Maori people. Stout also argued that this plan would improve race relations and serve as, in her words, the means of breaking down the race prejudice. And she meant the race prejudice between the Maori and the Pākehā. And this race prejudice, she said, could only be dissipated by closer contact. So my presentation today, I want to begin by tracing the precedents of Stout's proposal and how the civilizing mission of domesticity informed Maori girls' education from early efforts by missionaries in the first half of the 19th century through the 20th century. And I also want to look at reactions to Stout's proposal, and specifically the reactions of different groups like Maori reformers, Maori women, and also Pākehā settlers, and how their reactions revealed differing visions for New Zealand and for their communities at a critical juncture in New Zealand's history. Well, historiography about New Zealand domestic servants often contends that Maori female servants did not exist. Primary and secondary evidence suggests that they were not as much of an anomaly as often implied. And in fact, the Pākehā, and especially missionaries, had a long history of employing Maori servants. Early missionaries to New Zealand attempted to employ Maori girls as servants in their households in order to convert them to a Christian and what they saw as a more civilized way of life. Now, on the return leg of the famous voyage of the HMS Beagle, Charles Darwin made a brief sojourn in New Zealand. And you can actually see a picture of the HMS Beagle on the slide, as well as a map showing Darwin's voyage. Darwin would spend 9 days on the Bay of Islands, which is at the north of New Zealand, in December 1835. and he was actually not particularly impressed with New Zealand. He described it as a land of cannibalism, murder, and all atrocious crimes. But there was one bright spot for Darwin. In his journal, he observes the effect of missionary efforts on the Maori. In particular, he records coming across an English farmhouse and its well-dressed fields with Maori men laboring in the fields and playing cricket. He also describes seeing Maori servant girls who were clean, tidy, and healthy in appearance and looked like dairymaids in England. Now, for Darwin, these all served as markers of the civilization of the Maori people and gave him, as he wrote it, a triumphant feeling at seeing what Englishmen could effect. And he also wrote that this gave him high hopes for the future progress of this fine island. While Darwin hailed the success of missionary efforts, missionaries themselves often experienced frustration at the limited success of their efforts to train Maoris as servants. For example, Eliza White, who you can actually see pictured here on the left-hand side, she was a missionary and recorded her efforts to train both Maori boys and girls in European domestic practices. And she often would detail her failed attempts to train Maori children. So in her journal, she writes, "The conduct of our domestic natives causes me to indulge an angry spirit, and this brings darkness and heaviness in my mind. It seems as though Satan was stirring up our boys and girls to quarrel and be insolent, for I never found them more so." White's effort to train Maori girls as servants were largely ineffective, and in fact, there were some girls who ran away. In explaining why such attempts were not successful, missionaries like White cited the differential notions of childhood between the Maori and the Pākehā. And specifically, as the missionaries viewed it, the Maori's more permissive parenting of their children. And we can see this if we look at an account written by another missionary, Mary Carolyn Taylor, who you can see pictured on the right-hand side. So she wrote in her journal about Maori child-rearing practices and her discussions with Maori mothers about raising their children. So she reflected, "I had a long talk with the women about the management of their children. They owned that all I said was right, but contended that Maori children would not listen to their parents as a European child would. I told them it was because they were too indolent to enforce what they knew was right. They appeared fully convinced of their error, but did not seem inclined to attempt a reformation." So as illustrated by these missionary encounters, the Maori and Pākehā had different ideas about child rearing and the role of children in family and community life. The missionary and European emphasis on individualism and the nuclear family as a basic unit of society contrasted with the communal, close-knit, and extended kinship structure of Maori society. So within Maori society, we see that the care of children was shared among members of the extended family. And this more community-based approach to child rearing led in part to what was seen as being a more permissive view or way of raising children. Now, despite the limited success of early missionary efforts, domesticity remained the cornerstone of Maori girls' education through the mid-20th century, both at missionary and government schools. And I have on here a couple images from both missionary schools on the left-hand side and also other government schools on the right-hand side. Now, the educational efforts among the Maori were framed in humanitarian terms and as being in not only the children's, but the Maori community's best interests. Education was framed as really aiding the progress of the Maori people. Yet such discourses actually concealed multiple, more self-interested motivations. It in fact served as a way to domesticate New Zealand girls and reform them in a way that would make them useful to the colonial enterprise. So like schools for Indigenous children in other parts of the empire, like Australia and Canada, schools sought to assimilate Maori girls and break their bonds with their Maori communities by instead raising them in a Pākehā environment. Now, girls' perceived malleability and their future roles as wives and mothers meant that they were especially valuable to the colonial project. And it was hoped that they would return to their communities and build their own homes with these acquired Pākehā habits, values, and culture. So turning back to the proposal that I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. So Stout's plan to train Maori girls in the methods of European domesticity very much built upon these long-standing discourses. And her rhetoric often employed tropes that were used by missionaries. Stout framed her argument for training Maori girls as servants by arguing that the reform of the Maori people would begin with girls through their European education. So she stated the Maori girl had only to be trained, had only to have the opportunities, and she could show that she could work as well as the European girl. Like missionaries, Stout recognized that cultural differences separated Maori and European girlhood, but she thought that education could reconcile these differences by making Maori girls more European and, in her eyes, more civilized. Stout indicated that her plan had both long-term and short-term objectives. In the short term, it could help Maori girls find useful employment, but in the long term, she saw it as a way to reform Maori society and by extension, New Zealand society. So in a speech that she gave to the Maori Congress in Wellington, she stated, "It is generally recognized by those who have pondered on the problem of the uplift of the Maori people that one of the first requisites of any scheme of reformation is that their womankind be induced to accept the modern standards of domestic economy and to model their homes on the European plan." So like earlier missionaries, Stout portrayed girls as these valuable conduits through which British habits, values, and culture could enter Maori communities. Stout's proposal to train Maori girls as servants generated much discussion among both the Maori and the Pākehā, and her plan met with varying degrees of acceptance and opposition. So sections of Pākehā society opposed the plan, fearing the presence of the racial other within the home, but other Pākehā, and especially as you might imagine, women who were eager for servants, supported the scheme. Stout's proposal also received support from Maori leaders, including members of the Young Maori Party. And the Young Maori Party were European educated Maori men who were interested in improving the welfare of the Maori people. Now, the Young Maoris did not necessarily advocate for assimilation into the Pākehā culture, but they did not wholly reject European influences either. And instead, they emphasized the selective adaptation of European culture, while also emphasizing the preservation of many Maori traditions. Since most young Maori members believed that improving the Maori race meant the adoption of some European ways of life, they supported Stout's plan as complementary to their objective of improving Maori welfare. And I have on here some of the key figures of the Young Maori Party. And I wanted for a moment just to draw your attention to the figure who's on the upper right-hand side. And this is Aparana Nagata. And he was a young Maori member, also a member of New Zealand's parliament, and he expressed support for Stout's plan. He stated that the Maori must somehow learn to know the meaning of home as Europeans should understand it. Now, despite receiving support from some young Maori members, the idea of training Maori girls as servants also encountered opposition from some young Maori members and also Maori women. And they criticized the logic of Stout's proposal that service would somehow uplift girls. As part of her proposal, Stout attempted to reframe domestic service as ennobling, but Maori women realized that domestic service was not an avenue to social mobility, but really instead that it would degrade Maori girls and, in the words of one Maori woman, make them slaves of the pakeha. And I wanted for a moment to draw your attention to one Maori woman in particular who you can see pictured on the slide, and this is Miria Pomer. And she was really one of the most vocal critics of Stout's plan. And she challenged not only the genuineness of Stout's desire to uplift the Maori people, but also her rhetoric of equality. So in an article entitled "The Pride of Race," Pomer writes, "I have yet to learn of any race in the history of the world that has been uplifted through the medium of domestic service." In addition to criticizing the servant life as somehow uplifting, Maori women significantly framed their opposition to Stout's plan by emphasizing the distinctive girlhood of Maori girls. Stout's scheme rested on a singular, universal notion of girlhood and emphasizing the similarities between pakeha and Maori girlhood. However, in arguing against the practicality of Stout's scheme, Maori women cited the incompatibility of domestic service with the Maori way of life. So for instance, Maori women talked about how Maori girls primarily lived in rural areas and, in their words, were born an open air girl. So girls were not suited to the confines of the home. Moreover, girls typically worked as servants during their adolescent and teenage years between childhood and adulthood. And this was a stage that Maori girls did not really experience because they often married earlier than Europeans, usually around the age of 15, but sometimes earlier, and betrothals often took place earlier. So in response to Stout's belief that education could mediate the differences between Maori and pakeha girlhoods, Maori women instead emphasized the different cultural values of the Maori and pakeha and resisted this potential reformation of Maori girlhood and Maori culture more broadly. The resistance of the Maori towards domestic service not only stemmed from fears of racial decline, but also concerns over identity loss. The pakeha, who were encouraged by the declining population of the Maoris around the turn of the 20th century, envisioned the imminent assimilation of the remaining Maori people into pakeha culture. However, the Maori recognized the threat that assimilation posed to their culture, and that for them, this is in the words of one Maori person, fusion spells annihilation. So we see then that the welfare of girls was inextricably connected to racial survival. This plan that was proposed by Stout would not only disrupt the Maori way of life, but would also extend the influence of the colonial state into the uncolonized sphere of the Maori home. Now, due to substantial opposition, particularly by Pomer, but also other Maori women, the Maori Congress at Wellington dismissed Stout's scheme, concluding that the employment of Maori girls as domestic servants amongst Europeans was not desirable in general practice. When looking at the failed plans to train Maori girls as domestic servants, scholars focus on British settlers' racial prejudices as a decisive factor without acknowledging Maori resistance to the proposal. We see that British settlers sought to create an empire of the home by creating an empire within the home. But while the domestic world was a site of colonial power, it was also a site of resistance. The servant debates revealed the precariousness of colonial power and brought to the forefront anxieties about racial, class, sexual, and gender boundaries within the British Empire. It also brought to light differential notions of domesticity, masculinity, femininity, and girlhood. And it reveals the ways that girls were integral to the respective visions of the Maori and Pakeha communities. So I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I look forward to talking with you more at the conference.